back to the Nomiki show. All right, this is not really a surprise, but scary. I'm not surprised because I don't think anybody's surprised by anything that came out of the Trump administration, the Trump family. But our dear friend has covered this. Jared Kushner. They're not giving up on really taking on these guys. Jared Kushner is a definite pal of the Saudi Arabian crown prince. That's a dangerous move, in my opinion. I'm just like, how do you get in business with these folks, man? But our next guest, John Nichols, has a piece out in The Nation right now discussing Jared Kushner's Saudi side hustle that merits a full-on criminal investigation. Elizabeth Warren, Senator Warren, has called in the DOJ to investigate Trump's son-in-law. Hello, John. How you doing?
I'm very good, Nomiki. It's good to see you.
Nice to see you too.
Yeah. You have a different backdrop.
I guess it's a little different today. But your lighting is really great.
It's midday in Wisconsin.
Midday in Wisconsin. So, John, to get in business with the Saudi Arabian government, you really got to be in trouble. No, like what's behind this?
Well, let's put it in perspective. Republicans, not all of them. I'm sure there's some that are kind of put the lie to this theory, but generally Republicans are pretty bad at business. They are incompetent. They tend to rely on cronyism rather than entrepreneurship or actual talent or anything like that. And so there's a long history of these inherited, powerful, privileged young men who don't do well in business, aren't good at what they do. And so they have to look further and further afield for investors. Famously, George W. Bush, back in the early years of his business career, screwed up so frequently in Texas that Texas investors wouldn't touch him anymore. Wow. So then he went to out-of-town investors, people from other states. They invested with him. He failed so miserably that eventually he started looking for European investors, right? And people in other places. Finally, he got to the Saudis, right? And at a certain point, what you realize is that when the Saudis invest in you, when they put big money in you, they're not doing so because they think you're good at what you do. They're doing so because they want something. They want influence. And if George W. Bush was a lousy businessman, just somebody who's completely incompetent and ended up with the Saudis, Jared Kushner is that on steroids. Jared Kushner has pretty much wrecked everything that he has ever touched. He is so bad at business that in New York City, where he operates, people, they see him coming with his hand out there, they run screaming from the room, right? Mm-hmm. Because they know that if you invest with Jared Kushner, it's almost certain to go bad.
Is that something that existed before the Trump era, or how much of that is okay? I mean, he used to own the New York Observer. His father went to jail, right?
Yeah, and it's why he's still mad at Chris Christie because Chris Christie was the U.S. attorney that effectively put Kushner's dad in jail, and Kushner's father, actually, by some accounts, was relatively competent at business. And there are other Kushners that are relatively competent at business. They're not Republicans, but
his brother, right? His brother,
including yes.
Why do I know so much about the Kushners?
I know, well, because they're so interesting. But Jared Kushner, no, he's horrible at what he does. He bought a big building in New York City with, I believe the address was 666, and it went horribly awry to the point where he pretty much came close to wrecking his whole family's wealth and privilege. And so look, people don't like to invest money with the guy. So fast forward to the current moment. Now that we have it in a bit of perspective, when Jared Kushner served in the White House, he was the Saudis' point man. He was there for them on anything that they needed. If a call was made, Jared Kushner responded to that call. And if it was necessary to, lie, cheat, steal, deny a murder, he would do it. Right? This was how Jared Kushner operated. When he came out of the White House, of course, he needed to make money. All the people around Trump always need to make money. And so he set up a, kind of a venture capital project. Of course, as you can imagine, nobody in their right mind in the United States would go near it. But the Saudi Arabians came through with $2 billion.
Unbelievable.
I know. $2 billion in, just sort of like, hey, here's some money, go for it. Right. Yeah. And that when it came through, you thought, wow, that's pretty amazing amount of money. But what's really amazing is when you look at the rest of the investments in Kushner's, this fund that he's set up, there aren't any. There's virtually nothing.
Wow.
Almost no one else has put money into it. So effectively what you've got is a situation where a guy served for 4 years in the White House doing the bidding of the Saudis at every turn. And when he comes out of the White House, he sets up a vehicle that the Saudis put $2 billion into, right? Effectively, making it a reality that it would not have been otherwise. Now, this is such an obvious quid pro quo. It's such an easy argument to make because literally Kushner is so incompetent that it merits investigation. It merits inquiry. You have to say, why did this happen? And if it did happen because Kushner had served Saudi interests while he was in the White House, then you have a flat out scorching scandal that ought to be investigated at the most fundamental level by the Congress, by the courts. But then, you'd say, oh, but how can we confirm that? How can we get to the heart of the matter? Well, as it happens, the Saudi fund that invested with Kushner has experts. They have professionals who come in and analyze requests for their money because, no surprise, people are always asking for Saudi money, right? They, give me $1 billion, give me a couple billion. I want to do something. And so they actually brought in a team of people to analyze the proposals. The analysis of the proposal from Jared Kushner said he's got no track record in this kind of investment. He's not good at it.
Wow.
It's not a reliable investment. This is not a good idea. So we actually have the paperwork that says this shouldn't have happened. And yet it did happen. And so at this point, if it doesn't get an inquiry, if we don't look seriously at it, then effectively what we're saying is there's nothing that happened during the Trump presidency that is going to face any kind of scrutiny or any kind of accountability. Because this is really the kind of, the flashing red light. This is the lowest hanging fruit. This is the easiest target. And, it astounds me that Democrats haven't, rushed to do more.
I'm not astounded, but
I know I've seen polite. Yeah.
So is this how is this different than, say, the Chinese buying the White House in the 90s?
Look, it's not so different.
Okay.
At some fundamental level, I think we recognize that there's a money in politics reality that goes deep in our system. We go, Karl Rove's hero was William McKinley and the people around him, because McKinley was the last really effective corrupt president. And, they literally celebrated. Rove wrote a book about this. He's like, he loves these guys because they were so, meticulously crooked in how they did it. And so the bottom line is that we've always had this in our politics, and we have had it in both parties. There is simply no question that this is certainly anybody who's looked at the Chicago machine in its so-called glory days knows that this is nothing new. But it's now writ large across our politics in a much more fundamental way, because frankly, the bad players of the past were petty crooks. Yeah. By comparison to what we're seeing now. Spiro Agnew got tossed out of the vice presidency for taking, like some cash in an envelope from some road contractors. That's low level stuff. It's bad, but it's low level. What we're dealing in now is billions of dollars. And I do think that what happens is that because both parties are so in league with Wall Street the investment bankers, the billionaire class, that they don't like to, in fact, they may not even imagine that when you get to that level of money, that kind of money, that it can be corrupt. I know it seems absurd, right? They would
It's just so systemic.
right. It is. Yeah. It is sort of like, well, this is how it works. And so I do think that there are Democrats who, frankly, are cautious about this because they think, well, we really don't want to open up that can of worms. But the fact is, it's exactly the can of worms that needs to be opened up. And if I can just, extend it, if you want to take a story of the moment, right, that relates to this. Jared Kushner is obviously in trouble. We're talking about him. We're also talking of late. There's been a lot of discussion about John McCain and Steve Schmidt, the former McCain.
Oh boy, that was so much fun to read this weekend.
I know, yeah. In case if anyone tuned in, and I know you have the most politically informed people around, so we don't have to explain it too much. But Steve Schmidt, the former McCain campaign aide, sort of let loose, and he said
a lot.
Exactly. and I have a big piece up on the Nation website today about it. And what he said was, look, there were people running the McCain campaign who were in the service of Russian oligarchs and who, in fact, set up meetings between McCain and Russian oligarchs. Now, McCain himself was a little resistant to it. Give him credit for that. Yeah. But the fact of the matter is, this shows how systemic it is, and also the fact that when you look at Russian oligarchs having influence in the Republican Party, it started long before Donald Trump showed up. And then you ask yourself, well, how did that happen? Well, it happened because of money in politics, and because of the ugliest play out of money in politics, which is not the money spent on campaigns, although that could warp campaigns and make them awful. It's the intersection of campaign strategists and lobbyists. And so what you have is a situation where campaign strategists, they kind of like, every 4 years they run a presidential campaign. What they do the rest of the time is the really crooked stuff. They lobby, and increasingly they lobby for whoever around the world has the biggest pile of money. So Paul Manafort, Rick Davis, people who were literally, Davis especially managing the McCain campaign, Manafort, who was chairing, chaired the Dole campaign, influenced the McCain and Bush campaigns, chaired the Trump campaign. Do you see a pattern here, right? This is a guy who literally went to jail for his ties to the Russian oligarchs, his efforts to influence campaigns, and then got pardoned by Trump, right? No accountability. And so when we start to understand this, the revelations about Jared Kushner, what we just hear, with Steve Schmidt and all these folks, what I can point to any day of the week, a scandal, you can almost always trace that scandal back to the willingness of the consultant class, the strategist class, for both parties to lobby for the worst players in the world, and then to intersect that lobbying with their political service, i.e., as happened with Schmidt, to get a dinner for John McCain outside of Davos in Switzerland with the guy who is referred to as Putin's favorite oligarch, a guy who, by the way, is still Putin's favorite oligarch.
So it's interesting because I'm also thinking on the Democratic side, like, how does this look sometimes? I assume folks are familiar that Saudi Arabia, Israel, Russian oligarchs have invested in a lot of tech companies, whether it's early investors at Facebook, Russian oligarchs, or Saudi Arabian. The prince is investing in a lot of tech companies. I'm not even sure what the list is. But, there are people who are former White House officials that are now lobbyists or executives at these tech companies, like, David Plouffe. And I think he was over, I don't know if he's still at Uber, but he was at Uber. I mean, it's not even just lobbying anymore. It's like, so for Jared Kushner, it's an investment fund. For these other White House officials, it's the tech companies or I don't know what the next company is, that they find a way to launder their money in through influence in a really like backdoor way that's not as in your face as, just taking the money.
Sure. Well, but crypto's on the move. Crypto's on the move right now and hiring all over the place. Yeah.
Yep. So I have a question just in the geopolitical sense of how does Jared Kushner's you know where I'm going here. How does his politics when it comes to Israel line up with his politics and relationships with Saudi Arabia? I'm really confused about what these people are getting and at what times and who their allegiances are really for.
Yeah,
Tied
well,
to.
you're asking me a really painful question about, how do you get inside Jared Kushner's head, right? And it's like heaven knows what's going on in there. It's ugly, to be sure. But look, there is a long history of political players who announce their great solidarity with Israel, and yet who also do business with Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis know about this. They understand this dynamic. The Israelis understand this dynamic. It's a very interesting reality that you see these places where money trumps everything, and I think that for Kushner it becomes an especially fascinating reality, because remember, and I know this is so absurd. It's like, I mean, I can't even imagine a comparison that would sum up the absurdity of it. But Jared Kushner was in charge of trying to achieve Middle East peace.
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, that's what I'm telling you. And so, you're like, okay, well, that's there you go. He certainly knows the players, or at least he made an attempt to. Newsflash, he didn't succeed in that. He's failed in everything he's ever done, including achieving Middle East peace. But in that setting, the question that you have to ask yourself is, was Jared Kushner, when he was in the White House, interested in achieving Middle East peace or in maintaining a Middle East status quo? And this becomes an interesting dynamic here, because if you really are looking for peace in the Middle East, you also have to look for a measure of economic justice, right? A measure of equity in a number of countries, and for people who have the great mass of people who've been historically dispossessed, right? Be they Palestinians, be they the great mass of Egyptians. You can run down the list of folks who either live in sovereign states or in contested territories, whatever you want to say, however you want to describe it. You go across the Middle East, there's a great deal of economic injustice. We understand that. If you want to get toward an equity, right, that might lead to peace, right, and that might lead to much more cooperation. I've reported a lot in Israel, Palestine, Jordan, other parts of the Middle East. I can tell you that there are people on the ground, Israeli peace activists, Palestinian activists, who can point you to solutions that could work, right, and say, this could actually happen. And same in Lebanon, same in other places. But what ends up happening too frequently is the power players in the region, including the Saudis, they prefer a circumstance where there is a tension there, right? And what do they get out of it? Well, they get massive U.S. military aid and sweetheart deals for the Saudis to buy all sorts of military equipment, which they then use against Yemen, one of the poorest countries in the world. And obviously Israel and Egypt both get massive U.S. Military aid and also economic aid of all sorts of other kinds. So you end up in this situation where there's a status quo that is very, very comfortable for the elites, right? For the very, very wealthy. It's quite horrific for a lot of other folks. But I think when you have someone like Jared Kushner, he comes in and he only moves in that elite circle. He doesn't begin to consult with or talk with people I've met who are sincerely trying to achieve peace. And I cannot begin to tell you what a difficult and frustrating task it is for Israeli peace activists and for Palestinian peace activists who really do talk to each other, seek to get someplace, and they just don't have buy-in from the powerful forces in the world, including those in the United States. And that's something we circle around to Jared Kushner, because, look, there's a lot of arguments that, in the Trump presidency, that for a variety of reasons you could have gotten toward peace. You could have moved in the right direction.
Mhm.
Instead, every evidence is they moved in the wrong direction. And you say, well, who benefits by this? And I would suggest those who seek to maintain a Middle East status quo benefit a great deal. And Jared Kushner, despite all of his pronouncements, ended up maintaining a very bad Middle East status quo, and one where he is now $2 billion ahead.
Jeez. So what happens next? I mean, Elizabeth Warren's calling for these investigations.
Yeah. Well, if past is pretext, or past, if past gives us any indication of where we're headed, nothing. And I hate to say it.
Meaning like she won't have enough. Like what does she have to do?
She wants to do it. Look, there's simply no question. And there are other, in fact, I give Elizabeth Warren immense credit on a host of issues. If there is a chance to step up and try and make something happen, she does. And she uses her own voice. She uses whatever influence she has. I've covered her for quite a while. I think she's genuinely sincere in this, and I think she has allies. But there are some other members of Congress that are sincere. But the notion at this point, look, there's another way to say it, Nomiki. Let's pause and go back and say, what haven't they investigated? What haven't they gotten to the bottom of? Well, you can say Jared Kushner. That's a good place to begin. It's a fabulous story. It's a great one, easy one, probably, right? But then that opens up all sorts of other deals, right? You can just see, if there's a Senate committee and Josh Hawley's on it, and he's going, yeah, but what about the Democrats who exactly? And but then you keep going down the list. I mean, investigations and accountability simply are not a part of the Biden administration at this point. Mm-hmm. And it's a really frustrating reality. We're around the time of looking at 1 million Americans who died as a result of COVID. And that's a low figure. We're looking tens of millions around the world. We're looking at tens of millions of people in the U.S. who got sick, some with lingering COVID. We look at hundreds of millions of Americans whose economic and social lives were affected. We have a mental health crisis in the country that relates to, the isolation, the other challenges. I mean, pretty bad situation. And we know that Donald Trump and the people around him deliberately lied and deliberately failed to take the basic steps as regards labor protections, as regards transportation protections, all sorts of other things that they could have done. That merits an inquiry.
What's so bizarre to me is they've been able to do what is the ultimate, don't do it to us because we'll do it to you move, which is impeach Trump twice. And yet they can't do an inquiry. I mean, is David Plouffe more important? Okay, fine. So there are Democrats who do this too. I'm not saying David Plouffe because I that's not as direct, but there are Democrats who do this too, but they're not that important.
Well,
you're going to kill your party
for
a few consultants that whatever, they're interchangeable. It's not like you can't find another one who didn't take money from Saudi Arabia or China, because if you set the standard, then this is what happens.
I think it is a risk in the eyes of Democrats because they have lost the accountability muscle, right? Mm-hmm. They literally, it doesn't even make sense to them. They don't understand. I've actually had top Democrats say to me, we can't really focus on accountability. We've got to focus on bread and butter issues, right? They always say that.
You're not doing that either.
They haven't done the basics. And so when they say that, they're not being honest, right? I mean, it's what they're really saying is we don't want to go down that avenue. We don't want to go down the avenue of looking at accountability and doing it in a serious way, because I think it's much more than just losing a consultant. It's losing a sort of a way of life politically. This idea that politics must always be cautious and centrist and we're better than the other guy. That's how the Democratic Party has operated now for decades, is we're not great. You don't have to love us, but we're not as bad as those guys. That's basically their official slogan. Well, the end result is that you have a dynamic Republican Party. Its dynamism is in exactly the wrong direction. It's horrific and wrong-headed, anti-democratic, et cetera, et cetera. But it's it's very electrified, right? It's energetic. It's always on the march. It's always on the attack. And then you have a Democratic Party that says, well, we can't do much, but if you give us power, we won't do as bad stuff Republicans would do. So why don't you just give us power and let nothing change, right? And they've gotten so used to that way of doing politics that, and it has worked for them sometimes, to be honest, over the years. It's been of some value over the years at sometimes. But the end result is, to my mind, that they have now set themselves up for a situation where, because of their avoidance of a focus on accountability, they run the very real risk of losing in ways from which they will never come back. And so the old balance that they imagined, right? We won't do a lot, but then the Republicans will come to power. They'll do such horrible things that then power will be given back to us, right?
Right.
So we won't do a lot that's good for the great mass of Americans, in fact, we'll do a lot for Wall Street, the Clinton administration example, exactly. Right? Then, Bush comes to power. Bush does, the war in Iraq, crashes the global economy, gives Cheney free rein to kind of wreck everything. And the Democrats get power back, right? Mm-hmm. And then lose it again, et cetera, this sort of back and forth. And I think they've actually gotten remarkably comfortable with that.
Yes.
A lot of the elites of the Democratic Party. Well, now we're in a situation where, they literally tried a coup the last time, the Republicans. I mean, they're getting pretty far out there. And to my mind, what this administration should have been about, the Biden administration should have been about, A, easing the pain of the American people. That's first and foremost responsibility. But B, accountability. And these things do not detract from one another. Right. The fact is that accountability drives policy. It makes it easier to do big, bold things. Franklin Roosevelt understood that. When Wall Street was against him, when the bankers were against him, he said, I welcome their hatred. Now, Roosevelt knew exactly what he was doing. He was saying, yeah, I want to be at odds with those guys. I want this to be a fight, because if there's a fight, people have to choose sides. If they choose sides, I think the great mass of Americans are going to choose the side of the New Deal and of a project that seeks to put people back to work, to build things, to do rural electrification. It may be imperfect, but at least it's trying. And I think the problem for the Democrats is they came in, they said, well, we want to do a New Deal, right? But what they didn't remember was that what powered the New Deal was an accountability instinct, holding bankers and wealthy people to account for what happened during the Great Depression, holding war profiteers to account. During World War II, the United States had an over 90% tax on corporations that were making more during the war than they had been before. 90% tax.
That's unbelievable.
They had a 95% tax on the wealthiest people. If their investments were, reaping bigger gains than before the war, you could be taxed as high as 95%. The end result was that people knew which side they were on. At this point, I think a failure to focus on accountability has put the Democrats in a situation where I think a tremendous number of people don't know which side the party that they put in power is on. They have a full sense. Now, the debate about abortion, which is very vital, may influence that and may give the Democrats some traction that they lacked. There are some other factors that may make this less of a blowout than some fear. I'm in the camp that says there's still plenty of room for the Democrats to make a play and perhaps to be far more effective in this midterm than some anticipate. But it wouldn't be this hard. It wouldn't be this difficult.
It shouldn't be this hard.
Exactly. If there had been a focus on accountability.
If John Nichols was running the Democratic Party and I was his vice chair, we would be in great, cleanup house.
It'd be a very different thing.
We know that we could talk about the consulting class and the DNC for hours, but that was the hardest thing was ridding out those conflicts of interest, and that's when they went hard and nasty and smear tactics and all the things that they do in their playbook, because that's their bread and butter. That's literally it. John, you have a new book out right now that I would love to have you back on to discuss soon. It's called Coronavirus Criminals and Pandemic Profiteers, something you just sort of tipped off. Who made money during the pandemic and why? And it's just such a great opportunity for so many wealthy people to take advantage of crises and death.
You'll notice that Jared Kushner is on the cover.
Jared Kushner, Trump, and Bezos. Yeah. You forgot about Elon Musk, though.
Oh, it's hard to keep up with it. Musk does figure in the book. I will tell you, and I will talk about it at some other time. So I won't belabor it at any great level. But I will give you one nice factoid, which is that during a pandemic where we were told we were all in it together, where 1 million Americans died, tens of millions got sick, hundreds of millions went through economic turbulence and social challenges. The billionaire class, the roughly 700 American billionaires, increased their wealth from $3 trillion to $5 trillion.
Oh, well, I feel like they could have gone double.
I know. Well, you see, the good news for the billionaire class is that while you suggest they could have made even more, they're during the course of the pandemic, at a time when they're literally seeing essential workers suffer and die to try and help the whole of humanity, there opened up a discussion in the financial press about who would be the first trillionaire in America. Would it be Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk? And at that time, that was when they were both flying into outer space with their space projects. And so the thing to understand is that there is no opening that the billionaire class won't take to enrich itself. And that sort of ties everything we've talked about today together. The fact of the matter is that when members of the billionaire class enter into so-called public service, they do not serve the public. They serve their own interests and that of the people who might invest $2 billion with them. And when they are supposed to protect us from diseases, they don't protect us from diseases. They lie to us. They fail to do the basics because at the end of the day, they think somehow in some political calculus that will be better for them. And ultimately, when pharmaceutical companies and other interests are called into the public service, they first off say, how much is in it for us? And so the fact of the matter is, the only people who really were all in it together was the working class.
Exactly.
And the working class suffered the most during the pandemic, and that's what I write about in the book.
John, we'll have you back on to discuss the book. Go check out John in the Nation. He has a story about Jared Kushner's Saudi Arabia scam, side hustle, I guess you could say. Very, very $2 billion side hustle. I wish I had side hustles that brought that money, but didn't, sell my soul out, I guess. And of course, the new book out right now. Go check out John Nichols. Thank you for joining us, John.
It's an honor to be with you, Nomiki.
If you're not already a patron, make sure to join us at patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. You can get a mug, a sticker, a bag, lots of stuff coming our way. We'll be right back after this break.